people ask, is it just going to turn into Iraq? Why don't they ask, what can we do to change things? What can we do to make sure that we learn from what has not worked in other countries, and we share those experiences with Syrians, and we work out where we could help or where we should actually just stand back and leave Syrians alone to get on with it? It is this weird fatalism, which I think is related to the sense of disorder.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinninmont. And this is Disorder, a pod where we talk about our mad, and increasingly madder world, which seems to be accelerating in its madness with political unrest speeding up around the world.
And some people might think that Syria is this faraway place, but in fact, it's at the heart of the Middle East. It's a place where every major power other than China, but we're talking Russia, Turkey, the UAE, Britain, France, America, have their own interests and their own interconnections. And Syria has had major regime changes over the last 100 years, from the end of World War I and the attempt to create an Arab nationalist republic, to overthrowing the French mandate in 1945-46, to all of the coups between 1949 and 1966, to now this 13, 14-year civil war. Syria, in Arabic, is al-qalb yili anqalab lil-aruba, the beating heart of Arabism. But it has been just a central cauldron of transitions and regional wars. And this is like a major spot, Jane.
So Syria is a super important and complex country that you and I have obviously followed for a long time. The media coverage, as with most crises, tend to focus on just a few sort of relatively narrow themes. So there's a lot about sort of rewriting the maps of the Middle East and effects on Iran. There's a lot of fear as well because of what we've seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, which you know so well. So I've done a whole bunch of interviews about Syria this week, and it seems like every question is this just going to be taken over by jihadis and go the way of other conflicts? So we are going to try to bring a different lens to this and to talk about dictatorship and transition. And hopefully, Jason, we can hear from you about how sectarian politics is being badly misinterpreted in many places. And we'll talk about what the rest of the world, especially democratic countries, could actually do to help push Syria down pathways where the worst scenarios are less likely, and to try to take some responsibility for a conflict where at the beginning, Western countries were super enthusiastic about how Assad must go, but now he's finally gone so much later, everybody seems kind of confused.
Yes, there's a paradox here, which is that it's exactly at a moment like this when a coordinated international community can have the largest impact, not only with aid, but with capacity building and with setting the parameters for how the new Syrian state or statelets interact with international institutions and what sovereignty they have. But yet, history tells us, like with the fall of Libya and other events in Yemen and now in Syria, it's exactly at the moment that you need the international community to be coherent and to have a unified approach that it doesn't. And you pointed out a great irony, which is that they've been preparing for the fall of Assad since 2011. And yet when it finally happens, no one is prepared. Why is that, Jane?
I think it is to do with the state of the international order, and also, in a way, with how people see history. I was just listening to this great podcast by David Runciman about bad ideas about history, and there's one about the end of history, the famous Fukuyama end of history, which now is kind of laughed at. But he was talking about how some people see history as linear progress, some see it as cyclical, and some see it as a pendulum that swings. And probably, to me, these are all patterns in our heads. These are about our reading of history more than anything else. But I think we are still seeing this pendulum swing away from the neocons at the time of the Iraq War. I think we had a period where Western countries did believe in a linear progress of the world towards something more democratic. It reached this peak of hubris with Iraq. And we're still somehow reacting against Iraq, even compared to 2011 and the time of the Arab Spring. Western countries knew they weren't in control of events, but they thought that they could influence them and bring about a more democratic Middle East. And then basically that didn't work, or at least it didn't work within a pretty short time frame of a few years, even though few countries have seriously democratized in the time frame of a few years. So now this is happening when international politics is in this disorder. We see Trump saying basically we should have nothing to do with this, we have no dog in this fight. We see Biden saying very little except, everyone should not interfere, kind of vague boilerplate statements. And the West is looking at this as though they have no agency and not really talking about democracy.
But the irony is that this has only happened according to this timeline because of Israeli actions. Everyone should make this completely clear. This is an end result or a tangential result of the October 7th attacks and then the Israeli decision to respond to Hezbollah missile shelling by decimating Hezbollah leadership. One, if Hamas didn't do that attack. Two, if Hezbollah had any brains and had not said that killing Israeli civilians in the north or just randomly shelling them was somehow in support of Gazans, we wouldn't be in this position. And then if Netanyahu and his leadership did not really hyper-escalate in response to the movement of 60,000 Israeli civilians in the north out of their homes, we wouldn't be in this place. So it is a question of action and Western reactions that got us here. It's just not coordinated ones where European countries and North America and Israel and our allies in the Gulf have coordinated together. Everyone has acted randomly, and even the Israelis have not foreseen the end result of their actions, which is this.
Absolutely. And I think for some years now, it has been kind of middle powers and regional powers that have really had the most influence in Syria. We've seen the politics dominated by the so-called Astana process between Russia and Turkey and Iran. And most likely, Assad would not have survived this long if it hadn't been for Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah coming in to save him.
That's proof positive now. I had thought that there was more Alawi Asabiya, in other words, the solidarity of the Alawite regime to use brute force to hang on, and that it was only the Russians who were their air force and Hezbollah who were occasionally their special forces. But inasmuch as the regime was able to collapse so quickly once Hezbollah was taken out and Russia was distracted, we now learn that it has been the axis of evil and the axis of the disorderers who's kept Assad in power this whole time, and that it has not been internal solidarity. Why is it, though, that we've had all this time and there's been this Idlib, Hayat Tahrir Sham statelet for more than 5 years, and the West has not had a coordinated, unified policy towards it? Couldn't we have been influencing the government in waiting in Idlib coherently over these years?
I think there's two issues. I think one issue is that basically Western countries got cold feet about supporting the Syrian opposition with the rise of ISIS. And despite what conspiracy theorists on Twitter like to tell you, they have not really made peace with that idea that the Syrian opposition could be a positive force. Now they kind of have to work out ways to deal with it. But, they got very scared, understandably, when the face of the opposition changed to something more jihadi. All of which is quite complex because it's the brutality of the Syrian regime that resulted in the opposition becoming more violent. But nonetheless, Western countries got worried this was something that could threaten Europe more directly. And then the second thing, I think, really has been elements of distraction and short-termism in an era of multiple competing crises. People have not really had their eye on the ball with Syria. They assumed that it wouldn't change. They weren't watching that closely. They've been busy with other stuff. And I think that sort of distraction applied, widely. I mean, not just to Westerners. It was so interesting for me to be this weekend in Qatar, where I was at the Doha Forum. which was a really fascinating place to be as this unfolded, because the Iranian, Turkish, Russian foreign ministers were all there, and multiple Arab foreign ministers. And on Saturday, they were meeting in the Sheraton in Doha, trying to hammer out statements about Syria. But when this conference was being planned by the Qataris, who have been really active in Syria in the past, supporting the opposition, they framed the Syria discussion literally in terms of multilateral approaches to the frozen conflict in Syria, right? That was the conference session that happened on Sunday morning, the frozen conflict, because people from outside were misreading it. So there are lessons to be drawn, because this is also what we've seen with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is you've got this conflict, it's not being resolved, it's going on for a really long time, but lines are not shifting, and so people think we don't really have to worry about it. It's frozen until suddenly it isn't.
We know that the West was caught off guard. We know that even the Iranians were caught off guard. But what I'm unclear about is the point that you said earlier. It was seen as difficult to deal with the opposition to Assad since 2015 as it got more Islamized. First there was ISIS, but then Jabhat Nusra, and as they came to occupy their statelet in Idlib, we, the West, didn't engage with them, but the Qataris and the Turks did. Why is it that they were not able to coherently shape them, or we couldn't coordinate with the Qataris and the Turks as they were shaping them? I want to start with this coordination complexity issue, because that's what the enduring disorder is. And I think that we've just seen it in action. I'm going to postulate it's because France had a different view on it than Britain, and America is less willing to work with a designated terrorist organization than the Scandinavians, who have more of a history of talking to various groups, and Republican administrations have a different view of power politics and like their desire to abandon the Kurds than Democratic organizations, which really, really care about our long-term relationships with the Kurds. And again, it's just coordination complexity. So Western policy is ping-pong back and forth, and there hasn't been a through line about how do we deal with Rojava? Do we have a view that Rojava is going to be an independent state? Do we have a view that Syria should have territorial integrity? If it does have territorial integrity, is the Western position that we are going to advocate for a confederated Syria? Or are we going to stick with this unitary kind of Ba'athist Syria, but just with different processes? And I think the answer is that Washington and Brussels have no answers to these questions. And I just don't grasp how they have Charles Lister at the beck and call, and Tim Eaton and myself and you and everyone who says, we are out the wazoo at Chatham House and MEI with Syria expertise. And then you find out that Josh Landis hasn't been to the White House at all, and that no one has, drawn on this Syria expertise, and we have no policy. That's the part I don't get, and that I need you to help unpack with me.
There are so many great Syrian experts as well, thinking of Hassan Hassan, Rana Khalaf, one of my old colleagues, Haid. I mean, the expertise is there, but the strategic priorities haven't been clear. And, maybe it's partly because Syria is important to Europe, but it's not our neighbour. Maybe it's not surprising that Turkey would be more focused on what it wants. Also, it has been 13 years and governments have come and gone in all of the countries that you mentioned in the West, whereas, Erdogan's still there, Putin's still there. There has been more consistency, in a way, in the policies of dictatorships, which is something that is quite troubling. And I think that Syria has been an example of basically strategic dithering, different people taking different views about sort of what Western interests are and putting it in the too difficult box. I know that sounds like a fairly simplistic analysis, but I just think that this has actually applied. There has been a sense that there isn't a clear win. In a way, as Trump put it, like, Syria's not our friend. We don't know whether either outcome's good for us, so, let's stay back. All of which is really problematic. But there has been, maybe we can talk a bit about that time back when it was the Arab uprisings and there was more excitement and enthusiasm. A huge amount of work was done on what a transition for Syria could look like. Loads of track 2 dialogues with Syrian opposition and diaspora. And surely some of that work could be picked up now and actually used. But even, governments that like to invest in peace building stopped funding this stuff. Foundations stopped funding this stuff because they thought, guys, you've not managed to get democracy. It's been about 6 years now, so give up. Which doesn't really make sense, but seems to be this short-termism that we see everywhere.
Yes, this is the enduring disorder writ large, that there is no plan in Foggy Bottom, and certainly not in Brussels, where things are done at more at a national level, about what to do the day Assad falls. It was known that he would fall at some point. And yet there is no plan to handle this day, how are we getting humanitarian assistance there? Should there be a big conference? And of course, I'm going to be the first to advocate there should be a completely big jamboree conference. It doesn't matter if it's in Doha or in Amman or in Abu Dhabi, but it's got to be a jamboree where everyone pledges their billions for reconstruction. They meet the great and the good, not just Jolani, because we need to understand who the Kurdish players are, who is going to be, representing the Alawite community at these meetings, who is going to be the Druze player, what's going on in Sweda, how are the Sunnis in Dara interacting with their Druze neighbors, and no one is even discussing where the big conference is going to be, if there is going to be a big conference.
Honestly, the media narrative, which, is only one aspect of things, but the media narrative that I'm experiencing is really about fatalism. It is really about seeing the Middle East as a place that we sit and watch fall apart on television. People ask, is it just going to turn into Iraq? Why don't they ask, what can we do to change things? What can we do to make sure that we learn from what has not worked in other countries and we share those experiences with Syrians and we work out where we could help or where we should actually just stand back and leave Syrians alone to get on with it? It is this weird fatalism, which I think is related to the sense of disorder. In terms of plans as well, let's not forget that until really quite recently, the trend in the region that was supported by a lot of the Gulf states who themselves influence Western capitals was, let's rehabilitate Assad. It's time to accept the outcome of the fighting. You've seen him come back into the Arab League, and you've seen calls from some in the Gulf for sanctions to be lifted on Assad because it was assumed that he would be there to stay. I mean, in Doha, I was talking to some friends who'd just been at the Med Dialogues, the ISPI conference in Rome earlier in December, talking to a lot of international policymakers in closed-door sessions on Syria, where the assumption was Syria is now a long-term zone of Russian dominance and the rest of the world needs to come to terms with that. Italy, of course, had just reopened its embassy in Damascus because it thought that it needed to normalise with Assad. So there has been a big misreading of the situation, but in this time of disorder, there needs to be not just a plan, but a bunch of plans. It needs to be assumed that you could be wrong. Maybe the dictator is about to go. And then what happens and what do you do? Reconstruction has got to be key. I mean, again, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in comparison with Libya, but unlike Libya, Syria doesn't have much oil to speak of. The main cash cow has obviously been Captagon, but regional countries are really going to want to cut that off. So, what do you think? What would you say, based on what you've seen in Libya, would help take forward an economy that might be less corrupt?
Yeah, poverty could be an advantage because there is no central state coffers to just fight in a zero-sum way for. And that was the Libya curse, the resource curse, which is that there was a view that if you control the central bank or you control the road between the airport and the ministries in Tripoli, you have all the oil wealth. And of course, that's not really how it works. But militias believed that, and it led to a zero-sum conflict, and it led to jobism. In other words, I get my guys in power, and then they just dole out jobs, to people from their town. Syria is not going to have that problem. It's become poorer than most countries in Africa, or maybe one of the poorest countries in the world. It's certainly the poorest country in the Middle East. It makes Yemen look not poor right now. Therefore, there's nothing to fight for. And people are going to have to work together because you can't have the economy work just in, say, Damascus, but then not in Latakia and Raqqa. However, because there is so little to go around, there are going to be people who want to just flee and take whatever money they can get their hands on. I mean, looting is going to be a problem. Obviously, we've all heard that Jolani, the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, now the most powerful person in Syria, has said looting won't be tolerated and no going into government buildings. But of course, we also hear that there's looting. We also know that there are summary executions of extended members of the Assad family, but also just of Alawites, and that there are some random Alawites who've been like hanged and beheaded and stuff. And we knew that this was going to happen. But I think that the international community has more leverage than in Libya. So when the British and Italian ambassadors went to Mahmoud Jibril, the first transitional prime minister in Libya, and they're like, we can help you build an administration. And the Adam Smith Institute understands about economic management and how your cabinet should be constructed. And the Italians understand how the carabinieri, in other words, how do you have militarized police who are going to do this, that, and the other. They said, oh, no, thanks. We've got this. We can do those things. They didn't need the money. And therefore, they're like, well, screw you. We really are happy for you to do aid. And you can do civil society promotion. So there was a love by the NTC to allow Western funding of Libyan NGOs. And mostly diaspora Libyans would come back and they would apply for grants and, write them in Italian and French and English. And, they get grant money from Western institutions. But in terms of letting the real stuff that mattered, like how do salaries get paid and how do jobs that are bogus get put off the salary lists, and how do you do the reintegration of the militia fighters into civilian jobs and all of that, the Libyans largely passed on Western capacity building there. And that was, of course, to their detriment, because they could have also had Emirati and Turkish and stuff capacity building, which they didn't accept. They accepted, say, military training from those groups, but not the actual things that are needed to run a new country. In Syria, I think, unfortunately, the West learned the wrong lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan that we're not even going to offer these approaches. There isn't going to be here's how you build a cabinet, sir. We get that you're mostly an Islamist, but we don't mind. These are the principles of public administration, and we're going to be working with our Emirati and Turkish and Qatari and Jordanian colleagues, and we as a whole would like to embed in the ministry and teach you this, and here are the bankers, which are Lebanese Christians who speak Arabic in the same way as you, who are coming back from Paris to do this work for you. That's not going to happen. And obviously, my remarks on this pod are frequently interpreted by people as neo-colonial. And what I'm sketching is very 21st century and very non-colonial, actually, but it's coordinated and it's globally hegemonic. In other words, that the international community, the great and the good, we're not going to have Russians involved, but I have no problem having the whole spectrum from Moroccans to Turks to even, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and certainly the Scandis and the Dutch, who are going to donate a lot of money for this, involved in this effort. So I don't see it as neocolonial, but that's what I've learned from Libya, is that we have to have that. And in the absence of that kind of capacity building, probably there are going to be too many different bilateral approaches, and it will pull the Syrians apart and not help them.
I think there's huge capacity and expertise also among Syrians, especially lots of Syrians that have had to flee their homes. And as you say, also among Lebanese people, so many economists, so many bankers, again, lots of them have had to move elsewhere for opportunity. So I think another issue that's worth flagging here is how do you actually support that diaspora at this point where they want to go back and contribute, but also are a bit wary. And I think, what not to do is what we've seen a number of countries doing, including Austria, which is to say, oh, Assad's gone, cool, let's start prepping plans to deport Syrians straight away. Kind of amazing. So even as we say, God, we don't know if this is going to be another Iraq and Afghanistan, we also say it's safe to go home. I mean, it seems quite ludicrous. But what we will see is that clearly Syrians want to go home, and we've all seen these images of people going back from Lebanon, of the roads to Damascus literally jammed with cars, the reverse of most of the images that we see of war zones. But interestingly, refugee experts say that one of the ways to make sure that refugees do make the choice to go home is when they have the option to go back to the host countries afterwards. So counterintuitively, when a refugee gets a host country passport, they are probably more likely to return to the post-conflict or quasi-post-conflict society and start doing something there because it's not a final choice.
Of course, everyone wants to have an option. I'm willing to move back to America only once I have my British passport. It's extremely clear. I'll only feel safe from the revenge apparatus of the Attorney General's office once I have my British passport. I agree. And I would do the same if I was a Syrian refugee.
Look after yourself, Jason. Don't go back too soon. Maybe wait 4 years. But yeah, working with refugee experts, with diaspora, working out ways that people can actually go back and do things for themselves. I think that's going to be one of the big, most helpful injections of capacity building that there can be.
But I want to just clarify my point. Obviously, Syria has amazing human capital, much better than Libya in many ways. Libyans are very good at engineering and certain things like dentistry and a tiny, tiny smattering of banking. But a lot of that banking is about how to avoid sanctions and to create shell companies. Syria has a much deeper pool of human expertise, not only in medicine, but in entrepreneurship and tech and other stuff. But it's without top-level public policy experience. I want to be clear that I believe in having this cadre of 100 or so public policy elite build me administration people, of whom it would be nice that some of them will be of Syrian or maybe Lebanese diasporic background, Palestinian diasporic background potentially as well, because keep in mind that when Syria was built and rebuilt after World War I and after World War II, the Bilad Sham identity, and that's the Arabic for the lands of Damascus, or this term Bilad Sham applies to the Levant in general. People became Syrian who were from parts of the world which would now be considered Jordan, Lebanon, or Syria. Syria is an inclusive identity, not only in a sectarian sense, but geographically, keeping in mind that a lot of elite families in Damascus came from Libya and Algeria when they fled the colonial conflicts there in the 19th century. So the Syrian identity is an absorbative thing, but these top officials who are going to be interacting with not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but whatever the transitional process is, because it has to be more inclusive. There are many groups who control their local areas, and there's going to be extreme localism in security arrangements, are going to still need to interact with something which is going to be the build me an administration thing, for which I believe a recognized international coordinated body is the key thing. And of course, the mistake we're getting is mostly what the UN process talks about is like, transitional justice or human rights. We need to make sure that the human rights are respected, when that's actually not the thing that's needed now. That was needed to curb Assad human rights violations. Where were the penalties? But what's needed now, to my mind, is this build me a cabinet. You were working at Chatham House in the early Arab Spring period. What are your lessons that you would bring about how to deal with Syrian civil society and opposition groups, and what went wrong then, and what can we learn from it and do it differently now?
I think the number one lesson that I would take is that political transitions are difficult. They're not linear. That's not an Arab world thing. That is an everywhere thing. The political transitions that have happened smoothly and peacefully tend to be outliers. So you need to take a long-term perspective and expect that there will be reversals. I think that's really critical. I think there were expectations in the time of the Arab uprisings, because leaders fell in some cases very quickly. There were expectations that democracy would come overnight, and sometimes expectations that, would be based on experiences in Eastern Europe, where actually the end of the Cold War, it turns out, is still playing out. But people often went in with the assumption there would be parliaments with parties that were left-wing and right-wing, and it would all be a bit the same. And you could transfer the experience and the programming to a different part of the world. There was probably also too much focus on elections, and I say that as someone who really believes in democracy. But if there are a lot of armed groups running around threatening people and bribing people, then elections are not necessarily going to bring you democracy, and they're not necessarily going to solve conflict. They can become the subjects of conflict. So that's going to be one of the issues for Syria. The regional countries have been pointing to UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which does set out a broad timetable for a political transition, which obviously wasn't respected because this resolution was passed years ago. But that transition probably doesn't need to focus on the timetable for elections. It probably needs to focus on power sharing and the incredibly thorny problem of how could you go about integrating these many different armed groups into some kind of national army? Because otherwise, if half the parties have their own militias and then some of them don't, I just don't see how you're going to get a workable democracy. I think Syrians have learned a huge amount from what has happened in other countries and also what's happened in their own countries. And I do think among the Syrians, all of that expertise is there. So a big international conference should be accompanied by a rekindling of fora for Syrian civil society to meet, to talk, and actually to be listened to, not just done in a kind of token way. So there's loads that can be learned, but I do agree with you that an international conference and some sustained international process is needed, because there's such a high chance that even Western countries will compete with each other with different agendas, and if even Western countries can't coordinate, how are they going to do it with others?
I think it's really important to stress that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham doesn't control Syria right now. That's not even possible. They're not a particularly coherent fighting force. What they have become is an authoritarian administration of the Idlib province. They have put lots of people in jail in Idlib. They've quashed dissent there. They've made free speech impossible in the area that they control. They have a savvy media relations group, and they have a very authoritarian command structure. The reason they were able to quote unquote march on Damascus so quickly is people follow orders, and they have a very loyal cadre at the top. And it is drawing on that loyal cadre at the top that has allowed them to be able to appoint a caretaker prime minister. They've chosen a man by the name of Mohammed al-Bashir. And it's al-Bashir who led the de facto government in Idlib over the last few years. He said that he's going to lead a transitional Syrian government until the 1st of March 2025. How he's going to relate with other groups, what his relationship with Jolani will be, difficult to say. But we can assume that Jolani will be the power behind the throne, and that there will be a very authoritarian command structure in terms of how Hayat Tahrir al-Sham actually operates, even though they're going to say very pluralistic things. However, they do have to work with other groups like the YPG in Turkey. They're going to have to work with the representatives of the various minority communities and different Sunni and opposition leaders elsewhere. Obviously, 90% of the country's land area and 80% of its population have only been under their control for a few days. So they don't have those contacts with the merchant class in Aleppo that survived, or with the Sunnis that work with the Assad regime in the Damascus suburbs, or with the Christian communities in Sahnaya and Sidnaya, or with the released prisoners coming out of that Sidnaya prison. So they're going to have a new web of institutional connections and a way of dealing with and appointing positions to people who don't come from within their ambit. We're being told that there are local and regional bodies, Christian bodies, Alawi bodies, Druze bodies, and, like the Hama Town Council, and the municipal leader of X has now said his area is free and that they're working with the representative of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in this way and that way. This reminds me kind of how things played out when Faisal and T.E. Lawrence took Damascus in 1919. A huge amount of civic organization happened, and the Arabs are actually very good at local civic organization, and they're very good at policing their own neighborhoods and preventing violence and looting. What are you seeing happening on the ground in terms of this local organization and the creating of deputies? The word in Arabic is mukhtar, and he's like the head man of the village. And the Ottomans would work with this headman from the village, but there's also an authentic tradition, I would argue, in the Levant in North Africa of producing a headman from a village who might come from an elite background. He might be an ayan, is the term used in the Ottoman Empire, to then represent his micro community or area to a larger body. And I think that there are many Syrian historical precedents that could be drawn on, but I think a Syrian conference where Nawab, and that's the plural of Naib or delegate, that delegates are going to be sent from each of these communities, maybe based on population, maybe based on geographical area, maybe based on sectarian representation, and then they're going to meet, maybe not even in Damascus, but they're going to meet somewhere, and there's going to be some kind of power sharing agreement where decentralization is cemented. And that's going to be a Syrian-led process. It would be nice if they consult with experts from what didn't work in Libya and Tunisia, and then with some international experts on constitutionalism. But that's going to be a Syrian-led process drawing on Syrian historical resonances, and it will be really exciting to see that play out.
I think this is really important, and it just underlines that we're not facing the choice between you've either got to have a centralized state dominated by one group and one family, or total chaos. There are so many things in between, and these are exactly the sort of issues that Syrians have been talking about and working on throughout the last years. I'm also going to tell you one anecdote about something completely different, because years ago I met Peter O'Toole, the actor who played Lawrence of Arabia in the film, which was shot in Syria and in Jordan in 1962. And after they'd finished filming, he was hanging out in Aleppo, enjoying some shopping for fabrics when the 1962 Syrian revolution kicked off. And he said that he actually had brought out the first photographs that British media printed of that revolution because he randomly happened to be there then. So he's passed away now. He won't see what's happening today, but he spoke of Syria with this huge admiration. And I don't think a lot of people know that anecdote.
I love that story. I wouldn't call 1962 a revolution, but a coup. People need to keep in mind that between 1949 and 1966, which is Salah Jadid's coup, the first Alawite coup, you have more than 10 coups. Syria was the most coup-prone country in the world in the period 1949 to 66, and we can see a return to those coups. So it's not like whatever emerges now is permanent. Let's pivot and talk a little bit regionally. You were in Doha. Did you meet these Iranian, Russian, and Turkish foreign ministers? What was your view about what Lavrov said to the conference? How is your vibe on what is Rosneft's interests in Syria? How is the Russians going to deal with the loss of their Tartus base? Why did they allow this to happen, Jane?
So fascinating. I mean, I sat just behind Lavrov while the Rosneft CEO spoke, but he mostly spoke about how unfair sanctions are, right? So nothing hugely insightful. But when Lavrov spoke, it was so fascinating because he had obviously come to this conference expecting that he would talk about how terrible NATO is and the conflict in Gaza, which obviously people were really interested in. But he was on the back foot talking in the Arab world about Syria because the typical lines that, the uprising is just a NATO conspiracy, etc., they just don't fly in a place like Doha, which is full of Syrians, many of them exiled. And mostly, he's a genius at deflecting questions. But there was one that seemed to hit home where he was asked by an Al Jazeera anchor whether there were parallels to the fall of Kabul. And he said, the Americans left much more shamefully, as though it's a competition between people leaving in ways that have various degrees of shame. I thought it was really interesting. And it seemed like it wasn't necessarily clear how quickly Assad would run away in the night, but it seemed like everybody knew, and that actually at some point, no one knows when, everyone, you know what it's like, everyone has their opinion and their speculation, but at some point, clearly there was a decision by the Iranians and the Russians to throw Assad under a bus and perhaps to make attempts to ingratiate themselves with new leaders and try to preserve some interests. I mean, Iran won't have many interests left to preserve in Syria. There have been some reports that it did reach out to HTS about protecting the Sayyida Zainab shrine and some other shrines. Russia will have to see whether they do manage to keep their foothold there, so important for Libya and elsewhere, but probably they will have tried to make some kind of deal with Turkey and with rebel forces so that they don't get cast out entirely. And clearly at some point it just became clear that the costs and benefits of supporting Assad had changed, that the costs were really, really high, that he couldn't be saved without a major military intervention, that Iran did not have the appetite to do, especially given that Israel would probably have got involved as well this time, as you say. And then the benefits were not so great because Assad talked the talk of the axis of resistance, but at the end of the day, Hezbollah, who saved him, was decimated. What did he do, really? Iran was attacked by Israel, nothing really from Syria. It seemed like his priority has been to keep things quiet, to keep Syria out of any escalating conflict with Israel. And he took his eye off the ball and underestimated that the threats to him would come again from inside. So it's quite fascinating. I also think it's a really positive thing for the transition that at the end of the day, he ran away during the night. You know, he didn't stand and fight to the last. He didn't have a Gaddafi-style end either. It's hard to see somebody as a martyr when they've just sort of sneaked off to Moscow with their family.
After the break, Jane and I delve into Israeli interests. The Israelis unleashed a chain of events which allowed Bashar al-Assad to be overthrown. But is it good for their interests? And what are they doing now? Let's talk about Israel. Israel is really what kicked this off. And there would be, and again, I want to underline this point, there would be no victory for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham if the Israelis had not decimated Hezbollah. That is like obvious. So the Israelis have allowed Sunni Islamists to conquer Damascus. But then has this served Israeli interests? We know that they have gone to Bravo line, and that is the line that they occupied in 1967 in the Golan, but withdrew from in 1974 when the new line of contact was established, and that they're bombing chemical weapons dumps and other arms and munitions. But other than those kind of technical, tactical things, how is this playing out? Is it good for Israel? What are they going to do? How do you see it?
Annoying to say, too early to tell, but I'm going to say it. I think that Israel has always had some mixed views in the security establishment about Syria. I do remember back in the 2000s when there were quite serious efforts to broker a peace between Israel and Syria on the basis that, although Assad provided the supply lines for Hezbollah and talked all the talk about the resistance, he also kept the border with Israel very quiet. And it seems like Israel's cost-benefit calculation again has shifted. But I do think that this was largely an unintended consequence of the decimation of Hezbollah, which was the group that posed the most direct threat to Israel. So clearly, they are worried about the potential for armed groups to attack them. The problem, of course, is that these unilateral steps to do with their own security are also sending a message straight away to the new leaders of Syria that they're kind of already starting off in a state of war. And that when they say we'll hold out the hand of peace, it's not matched by actions on the ground. I hope there's some kind of private outreach going on, perhaps via Turkey or others, because the potential to just have a new set of enemies also depends on Israel's actions now. And people in Syria will perceive what it's doing not just as security measures, but as a land grab.
Of course. And the Israelis would be wise to give some humanitarian aid and in a roundabout way to help some Syrian patients get treated in Israel and things like this, of course. However, the Israelis could take Damascus if they wanted to, literally by tomorrow morning. You know what I mean? They could march their tanks in and capture Damascus. That they're not doing that is because it makes no sense to do so. But I do think that HTS and others will grasp that whatever the Israeli military actions are is extremely limited relative to what they could do if they wanted to, right? It's that Netanyahu never misses an opportunity to make a bad impression and to not do good hasbara, which is the Hebrew word for explanation or PR. You know, he's so bad at PR. In other words, he's not explaining why it will be good for Syria to not have these chemical weapons dumps that people are fighting over and that they're going to help. I mean, I think that he has no strategic vision. So, of course, he's going to screw up these engagements with the new Syrian regime because the Likud is like the Iranian Ayatollahs in that they want a disordered region. They're very happy for Syria to be a chaos and a complete mess because so long as it's a complete mess, it justifies the security state in Israel. But I think they're going to miss an opportunity and that the Abba Ibn quote applies even more to Netanyahu than it does to the Palestinians right now.
In this disordered time and region, then, Jason, let's order the disorder, because I think a few interesting ideas have already come out of this discussion now. What can the rest of the world do to support a transition that involves real power sharing, and how to protect the groups that don't have arms and start to help Syria to move forward to have the kind of government and the kind of economy that it deserves to have? Where would you start? Tell us more about this conference that we could imagine.
There aren't going to be international peacekeepers, so it really isn't going to be on the international community to protect the groups that don't have arms. I think that there should be rewards and capacity building to areas where there's not revenge killings. So I'd like to extract some statements, not just from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but from others, that there won't be retribution against Alawite civilians. And like if X period of time passes and less than 10 people are summarily executed and seen on Twitter, you get this carrot. I know it sounds really mercenary, but I can't see another way of handling that. In terms of land grabs, similar things. Because the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham spokesmen are saying all the right things right now, but I would just have international bodies make relationships with the chosen deputies of these different groups and then have them report on, what are the crimes against their civilians and, have some kind of give and take there between the different groups and carrots and sticks. But I have no idea on that one, Jane. I just want to defer that to experts because there are people with that expertise. I want them to have a conference where the experts come up with the way of doing that. What do you think?
Massive humanitarian relief is clearly needed with so many people displaced and also hungry. And if that can be tied to a gradual lifting of sanctions, to a political transition and channeled through local authorities, that would be super helpful. There's lots of critiques that the humanitarian organizations have had to work with the Syrian regime in regime-held areas, and that makes them liable also to some of the aid being misappropriated. So a new aid effort that is less centrally controlled and gets straight to communities could really help with the sort of bottom-up rebuilding of Syria and finding ways also to get credit to involve the IMF and the World Bank and Arab development banks in, getting money in so that there can be jobs and businesses for Syrians to go back to. I would really urge countries not to just do the crass knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, hey, now it's the time to deport Syrians. As we've said, take that slowly, allow them mobility. That is the way you're going to get a sustainable return of the many, many, many refugees who do want to go back and contribute to their society. Just don't be an idiot about it.
There are many different issues there, though. Lifting of sanctions, linking that to political transition. Obviously, we can't just in one day have the US, UK, and EU say, oh, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is not a terrorist organization anymore. All sanctions are also lifted. Everything that we had against Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is over. And everything that we had against Syria because of the human rights violations of the Assad regimes, all the sanctions are lifted. So how do we phase that? you know what I mean, to help the Syrian people get that aid in there, help them rebuild their economy, but still have carrots and sticks.
I mean, this may well be something that constrains HTS from hubristically thinking that it will be dominant. It may well be a good incentive for power sharing. One theory that I've heard is that the group might try to reconstitute itself to say, you know, we're now in a new phase of struggle and we will become a political party, or we don't exist anymore, but hey, some of us are in this political party with some others. And that also might be a way to start to change the relationship with other countries around the world. I think that those other countries around the world will need to be cautious about lifting those sanctions and not just do it overnight based on promises. But also having sanctions on that group doesn't necessarily need to block money coming into the country, that if it can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily go right through the government, and that could be good in lots of ways.
Jane, tell us one story about you being in Syria that you think is fun or sheds some light on the country.
Well, I remember once getting a bus from Damascus to Beirut after going to visit a friend of mine who ran an NGO that taught capoeira in the Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. And I just remember how kind everyone was to me. It was in 2010. They didn't see that many Westerners. I stood out a bit. And at the bus stop, you know, my Arabic was terrible. Their English was terrible, but people shared with me sugary tea. They asked me about football. It was lovely. And I got on this lovely, lovely, friendly bus, and plastered all over the inside of the front of the bus were two types of picture. One was pictures of the driver's kids, and the other were Hezbollah pictures, including really quite brutal drawings of Hezbollah people killing Israelis with Stars of David on their head. And I just found it... the juxtaposition between the imagery and the niceness and friendliness that everyone was showing to me was quite something. The bus stopped on the way back to Beirut to get coffee, tea and sweets at a sort of service station type place. I bought sweets, took them back to Lebanon, got a taxi from the bus stop back to where I was sitting. And I remember offering a sweet to the taxi driver because I was using the local approach where you share everything you have to eat. He took a sweet, put it in his mouth, and I said, I just bought it in Syria. And he looked at me. He took it out of his mouth, threw it out of the car window and spat and said, I hate Syria. And it stayed with me. It stayed with me. You know? It was a beautiful place to visit. I hope to go back.
Jane, that's a funny story about the Syrian sweets and the Lebanese gentleman who spit them out because Syria had occupied his country and despoiled it for so many years. I want to tell another story of how the Syrian regime spied on me. I had Alawite friends in Syria, but I also had Alawites who were inserted into my friend group to spy on me. Some of the things that happened to me are not fit for the radio, but amazingly, when I came back from working in Muscat, Oman at the U.S. Embassy in 2004, I was detained at the airport for 2 days. And I was served tea and sweets, but I had to sleep at the airport. And I was asked a million questions while I was a Fulbright student. And none of the questions really led to anything. But I was sure thereafter that people were coming in and out of my apartment. So one of my Alawite friends at one time said, oh, he had no money, he this, that, and the other. Could he stay with me for a few days? I let him stay with me, but I noticed that sometimes my computer, my laptop would be ever so slightly oriented in a different direction. So that's my story about the old regime. Where are all its files? Where are all its information, not only about dissenters and about opposition people, but about all the other countries of the world? You know, are we going to, who knows what we're going to find in Syria's intelligence state on not only deals with Iran and Russia, but maybe the relationships of Qatari intelligence, of Mossad, of the Emiratis doing certain things. What are we going to find out about the roles that Christian Lebanese leaders like Michel Aoun have had in, allowing Syria to make money in Lebanon? What are we going to find out about American and Israeli security services cooperations with the Syrian regime, about various German and French business peoples dealing with the Syrian regime and skimming money off the top? Wow, that is going to be some disordering stuff that's going to come out. And it's going to be on people's cell phones, and it's going to be on some weird old computers in various ministries across Damascus. So fun there. So if you thought that the disorder was disorderly already, wait till it gets more disorderly as these correspondences from the Assad regime, and particularly its intelligence services, are uncovered. So if you thought this was a very fun weave that Jane and I did, please subscribe to the Substack, where we're going to have more thoughts from Jane, more background articles, and other stuff. And we're going to have some interesting paid-for material in the paid-for part of the Substack, some old audio. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. And what do we tell the listeners, Jane?
I wish you all an orderly week, without having to flee to Moscow in the middle of the night.
Yes, that's right. We wish them an orderly and Assad-free week.